In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. So said the statesman Benjamin Franklin. Well, some people have gotten pretty good at avoiding paying tax, but so far at least, nobody has successfully avoided death. For the moment at least, we're stuck with it. So the next question is, should we fear it? Hi, my name is David Egan, and in this series of lectures, I want to think through some of the ways we might respond to this question, is death a bad thing? One of the things I think you'll find as we go along is that this question about the badness or lack of badness of death isn't just a question about death. It's also a question about the value of life. After all, it's life that we stand to lose when we die, and reflecting on what we stand to lose exactly might help us reflect a little bit on what it is that we value about being alive in the first place. The purpose of this introductory lecture is to provide an overview of where we're going in the course, as well as to lay out a bit of a framework to give you some sense of what we're discussing, as well as what we're not going to be discussing. But before I get any further, I want to acknowledge the sensitivity of the topic. Death is a source of anxiety and stress for many of us, and many, if not most of us, have been touched at some point in our lives by the death of a loved one. Now, on one hand, our job as philosophers is to examine arguments rigorously and unsentimentally, and to be concerned with the validity or invalidity of those arguments, and not to worry about whether those arguments reach conclusions that make us comfortable or uncomfortable. On the other hand, we're dealing with a topic as precious as life itself, and there's a danger that if we proceed too coldly and too analytically, we'll lose sight of what it is that concerns us about this topic in the first place. Now, this is a fairly short series of lectures, and I am going to try to cover a fair amount of ground. And as a result, I'm probably going to err a bit on the side of the cold philosopher who's just looking at the arguments, trying to get clear on what's going on. But I want to acknowledge, to get started, that there's a lot more to be said on this topic than what I'm going to say. And that if you're uncertain about where you stand, I think a good guide is to ask yourself why this question matters to you in the first place. So what's at issue here? Well, if we're going to say that death is a bad thing, it's going to turn out to be bad in a way that is different from the way in which all other bad things are bad. Consider by contrast for a moment the experience of breaking your leg. What's bad about breaking my leg? Well, to begin with, it hurts a lot. Second of all, it's debilitating. I can't walk around on a broken leg. I'm going to have to get a cast put on it. I'm going to have to walk around on crutches and with a cast on for months. It's going to get really itchy under that cast. All sorts of things that come with breaking your leg are very unpleasant. What they all have in common, however, is that they're all very unpleasant experiences, starting with that initial experience of, oh my gosh, I broke my leg and it hurts a lot, to the later experience of, oh gosh, it's itchy under there and I can't wait to get the cast off. But they're all things that I can experience. Death, by contrast, is not something I experience at all. In fact, to the extent that we find death fearful is precisely because it's the end of all experiences. It's not itself an experience, so much as that point beyond which all experience ceases. So if most of the things that we say are bad because we experience their badness, death is bad in a different way, because it's not something we experience at all. And indeed, the fact that death isn't an experience is going to be a part of a key argument by the Epicurean philosophers that death isn't a bad thing at all. In order to get clearer on the scope of our topic, I want to list 3 things that I won't be concerned with in this brief lecture series. The first is the idea of an afterlife, or life after death. Now, this might strike you as strange. Presumably, whether or not there is an afterlife and what kind of afterlife you might be able to anticipate could significantly shape your sense of whether or not death is a bad thing. But really, what we're talking about when we talk about an afterlife is precisely the idea of not dying. It's the idea of death not being a terminal end, but something else, a transition toward something else. And what I'm concerned with here is the question of whether death understood as the end of you is a bad thing. Now, I will turn a little bit to talk about the question of immortality and whether immortality is desirable. Presumably that would be one way of not dying. And in that sense, you could consider the afterlife a kind of immortality. And when we turn to Bernard Williams later in this course, you'll see that some of his objections to the idea of immortality might plausibly apply to a more spiritual or religious idea of an afterlife. Second, the topic of these lectures is death and not dying. One of the reasons that people fear death is that death is often preceded by a great deal of suffering. Terminal illnesses are generally very painful and debilitating, and those are indeed things that are reasonably feared by a great many of us. However, the thing that is bad about dying is not so different from the thing that is bad about, say, breaking my leg. It's that we're having a series of bad experiences. I experienced that suffering, that pain, that debility, and those are bad experiences. But as I said a moment ago, what's distinctive about death is that it's not something that we experience at all. And it's that question of whether that lack of experience is a bad thing that I want to focus on in these lectures. And third, I want the focus to be on our own personal case. The question of whether my death is bad for me, rather than the badness of the deaths of others. And again, the deaths of loved ones, those who are dear to us, is one of the greatest sadnesses, one of the greatest misfortunes in life. But like dying, like breaking my leg, this is a bad thing that we can experience. And I'm not interested in these lectures in the badness of certain experiences. I should emphasize that different kinds of bad experiences can be bad in different ways. I don't mean to suggest that breaking your leg, dying, and losing a loved one are all much of a muchness, but just that they're similar in the sense that their badness is something that we live through. And that's not the kind of badness I'm interested in here. I'm interested in this question of what does it mean for me that at some point my life will come to an end. One last point of clarification. I'm interested in the question of whether or not death is intrinsically bad and not circumstantially bad. What do I mean by that distinction between intrinsic and circumstantial bad or good? Well, consider happiness. That's often taken to be a paradigmatic case of something that's intrinsically good. What it means is to say that happiness is good in itself. What makes happiness good is the happiness itself. By contrast, pain is generally thought to be intrinsically bad. What makes it bad is the badness in itself. By contrast, for example, money is not intrinsically good. What's good about money is that you can buy stuff with it. If you don't do anything with money, it doesn't have any particular value. It's not intrinsically valuable in the way that happiness is. Or consider rain. Rain is sometimes a good thing or sometimes a bad thing. It depends on your circumstances. So, for example, if you are planning a picnic in the sun with your friends and it starts to rain, that rain is bad for you. If you're a farmer who is hoping for their crops to grow after a long drought, then rain is a good thing. So, whether rain is a good thing or a bad thing really depends on your circumstances. And so in that sense, you could say that while happiness is intrinsically good and pain is intrinsically bad, rain is circumstantially good or circumstantially bad, depending on your circumstances. Now, similarly, there's a clear case to say that in some circumstances, death can be a bad thing. For example, if it's premature, if it comes too soon, that can make it bad. Or if it comes after a long and debilitating illness, as I said, dying can be a bad thing. But I'm interested in whether death is intrinsically bad, whether it in itself is a bad thing. Regardless of the circumstances under which it happens, do we want to say that death is in itself bad? Okay, so where are we going with this? Well, I've got 4 lectures for you after this introductory one. The first one, we're going to look at the argument of the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus and his later Roman follower Lucretius, who both offer arguments to the effect that death is not something to be feared. We'll look at the arguments in more detail when we get there, but the general gist is that death isn't, as I said, something that you experience. The only thing that can be bad is a bad experience, and so death, as something that you'll never experience, can't be a bad thing. By contrast, and this will be in the third lecture, we're going to look at an argument by the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel, who argues that death is a bad thing. And the reason he gives for that is that he thinks that life is a good thing, and that death is the deprivation of life, and being deprived of something good is a bad thing, and so death as a deprivation of life is bad. And one of the burdens of his argument will be to push back against this Epicurean argument that only things that we can experience can be bad. In the fourth lecture, we're going to turn to the philosopher Bernard Williams, who will offer a variation on Nagel's argument. He too will argue for the intrinsic badness of death. But then he adds a further twist. He's going to look at the possibility of immortality and argue that if we could live forever, that would also be a bad thing. In the end, Williams is going to offer us a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Death is a bad thing, but also immortality would be bad too. And we're going to wrap things up by looking at an interesting argument from the Swedish-British philosopher Nick Bostrom, where he is going to argue that although at present death is inevitable, it's not necessarily so. It's a feature of our biology, but a feature of our biology that we might be able to overcome. And he's going to argue not just that we should try to overcome at least some forms of death, but also that we should be devoting far more resources than we are right now to overcoming death.